The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that settled over everything like a thick, invisible fog. The only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator and the rhythmic ticking of the clock mounted above the stove. I stood at the counter, absently drying a glass, the warmth of the water still clinging to my fingertips. The night stretched long, the weight of stillness pressing against my skin. It was late, later than I had realized, and I had assumed I was alone. But I wasn't. I felt him before I heard him, that strange shift in the air when someone enters a room. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, a slow prickle crawling down my spine. My fingers stilled against the glass, and I turned my head just slightly, just enough to confirm what I already knew. He was standing in the doorway, my husband's best friend. He leaned casually against the frame, his eyes on me, dark and unreadable. The kitchen light cast a soft glow against his features, highlighting the sharp angles of his face, the way his lips curved just slightly as if he knew something I didn't. I blinked, surprised. "I thought you left already." He didn't move, didn't shift his weight like someone who had just wandered in by accident. Instead, he lingered there, watching me. "I was about to, but then I saw you in here." There was something about the way he said it, something deliberate, something heavier than just casual conversation. The way his voice dropped slightly, how he let the words settle in the air between us, waiting. I swallowed, my fingers tightening slightly around the dish towel. And his lips curved, not quite a smirk, but something close. And I figured, maybe you wouldn't mind the company. A slow ripple of awareness spread through me, something I hadn't been prepared for, something I wasn't sure how to ignore. I let out a breath, turning fully to face him, my heartbeat just a fraction too fast now. "Your timing's a little suspicious," I murmured, watching him closely. "Everyone else is gone. My husband is gone. And yet, you're still here." His smirk deepened, but he didn't deny it. "Funny how that worked out, isn't it?" I should have said something else. Should have laughed it off, brushed past him, made it clear that this was nothing more than a moment of coincidence. But I didn't move. Neither did he. The air between us tightened, heavy with something unspoken, something neither of us had acknowledged before. And yet, now that it was here, lingering in the space between us, neither of us seemed willing to break it. His gaze dipped just slightly, trailing over me in a way that wasn't accidental, wasn't casual. It was careful, intentional. The warmth of the kitchen, the faint scent of coffee and something sweet still lingering in the air, felt suffocating now, thick with something else entirely. Something that made my breath come a little shorter, my fingers twitch slightly where they still clutched the towel. He took a slow step forward, deliberate, measured. "You always clean up this late?" I forced a small smile, ignoring the way my pulse kicked up a notch. "Only when I have a reason to." He tilted his head, considering that for a moment before another step closed the distance between us further. "And tonight, do you?" I exhaled softly, letting my fingers skim the edge of the counter, grounding myself. "I think you already know the answer to that." His lips parted slightly, something flashing in his eyes, something dark, something restrained. His fingers flexed at his sides like he was holding himself back, like he was waiting for something. "Tell me to leave," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "If you don't want this." I opened my mouth. And then I didn't. The words didn't come. Because we both knew the truth. I wasn't going to say no. The silence between us deepened, stretching so tight it felt as though the very air around us might shatter if either of us moved too quickly. His breath was steady, but the way his fingers flexed at his sides betrayed the restraint humming beneath his skin. He was waiting for me to tell him to go, to break the moment, to remind us both of the line that neither of us had ever dared to cross. But I didn't. Instead, I let the stillness settle, let it coil around us like something alive, something electric. The warmth of the kitchen felt suffocating now, not from the lingering heat of the stove, but from the slow burn crackling between us. His gaze dropped, just briefly, just enough to make my stomach tighten, to make me fully aware of the space between us, or rather, the lack of it. The world outside the kitchen didn't exist anymore. There was no past, no future. Only this moment, suspended in time, waiting to tip over the edge. I licked my lips, a small, involuntary movement, but his eyes followed the motion, his jaw tightening just slightly. "You should go," I murmured, but the words had no weight, no conviction. His lips twitched. "That doesn't sound convincing." I exhaled, my pulse hammering against my ribs, each beat louder than the last. My fingers still clutched the dish towel, but they were restless now, twisting the fabric between them. "It should be." His breath came a fraction sharper, his body tensing like a predator sensing weakness. "Then say it like you mean it." I swallowed, my throat dry, but I didn't say it. Because I couldn't. His expression shifted then, something unreadable flickering behind his eyes, something he had been holding back for too long. And just like that, the restraint he had so carefully maintained started to slip. He took another step forward, his presence looming, his scent, faint cologne mixed with something undeniably masculine, wrapping around me. I could feel the warmth radiating from him, the tension rolling off his skin in slow waves. "Tell me to leave," he murmured again, but this time, his voice was different. Lower, rougher, or "Tell me what you really want." My breath hitched. The floor beneath me felt unsteady, the kitchen suddenly much smaller than before. Every part of me was aware of him, the way his chest rose and fell, the way his fingers hovered just close enough to brush against mine if I dared to move even the slightest bit closer. I didn't. He exhaled, slow and deliberate, and his fingers finally moved, grazing over the back of my hand, so lightly it might have been accidental if not for the way my skin burned beneath the touch. "Say the word," he whispered, his breath warm against my cheek. I tilted my head just slightly, my lashes lowering. "I think you already know." His restraint snapped like a rubber band pulled too tight for too long. His fingers finally closed over mine, firm, deliberate, pulling me just enough that the last sliver of space between us disappeared. His breath mixed with mine, his presence overwhelming, consuming, inevitable. I should have stopped it. I should have thought about the consequences. But in that moment, consequences didn't exist. There was only the pulse of my heart, the heat of his skin, the undeniable pull of something neither of us could pretend we didn't feel anymore. "This is dangerous," he murmured, his voice barely more than a breath. "I know." His grip tightened, his body tensed, and for a fraction of a second, we hovered on the edge of something irreversible. And then we fell.